All right, I guess we'll ask everybody to come back in and have a seat. Okay. Well, thank you again for being here. And I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Ken Dryden. And as a ex-Montrealer, to me, he's a Canadiens goalie, but he has done other things in his life. He was a member of Parliament and was the Minister of Social Development in the Martin government. He's written many books, and today he's going to come talk to us about the state of play, where we are and where we go from here. Ken Dryden.
Thank you, and good morning. I was glad to listen to this morning's presenters, Julian Bales, Lily Naz Hazarati, who always has something interesting to say, Charles Burke, and the poster presenters, and I very much look forward to the rest of the day. Time is always tight in these conferences, and so I'll get right to my presentation. I've been involved in sports almost all my life. And whenever anybody around me wants to play something, hockey, baseball, football, basketball, tennis, badminton, golf, swimming, track and field, and as an adult, squash, hiking, skiing, rollerblading, I want to play too. And why not? I've been involved as a player, a fan, a parent, a coach, a team executive, a commentator. I love sports. I love the impossible, incredible stories of sports. One of my favorite books is Invictus, about the South African rugby team, the World Cup, and Nelson Mandela. One of my favorite movies is Hoosiers. A few weeks ago, I watched Eddie the Eagle. I wasn't going to watch much of the Olympics this past summer, then I got sucked in again. Not just by the obvious stuff. I remember the last day of the games in the morning, turning on our TV, and there were these women in spangly costumes. And I knew that I wasn't going to enjoy this. It turns out it was rhythmic gymnastics, the team event. 5 women with hoops and clubs, doing leaps and flips and splits, throwing these hoops and clubs blindly into the air until somehow, just before they landed, somebody else looked up, it's there, and she would catch it. Then they would do it again and again. If you want to see a real team sport, where no one player matters at all without the others, rhythmic gymnastics is it. It is unbelievable. I've had almost nothing other than great experiences in sports. The 2 concussions I've had in my life, if they were concussions, did come from sports. The first was playing Kaiwai football in Etobicoke. And I was about 12 years old. I was the quarterback. I went back to pass, and the next thing I knew, I was on the sidelines and wondering what had happened. And the next time was many years later, from teaching our son, by trying to teach myself how to skateboard, which was not smart. But I've had no significant other injuries, and I don't feel the effect of a lifetime of sports today, maybe from a few other things, but not from sports. When I watch games, I don't think, been there, done that. Everything still seems new and fresh. I'm completely amazed by what I see, by what people can do, by what they are even willing to try. I find everything still filled with the same unknowns and possibilities and impossibilities as it always was. But I worry about sports now in a way I never worried before. Part of that is age. I'm more aware of the consequences of things now. But a bigger part is that the risks of sports are far greater now than they once were. From these experiences in sports, playing, watching, at the highest and lowest levels, I'd like to mention a few things just to put in the back of your minds. First, to say this up front. I believe the greatest risk to sports in the future, to the number of people who participate, to the games we decide to play, us, our kids, and our grandkids, and to our understanding of sports as something good for our health and our development, is head injuries. I wrote an article about 6 years ago on concussions for the Globe and Mail, La Presse, and Grantland. My title, I don't remember if it was the one they used, was, "How Can We Be So Stupid?" I mentioned some things from history, from reading books or watching movies about slavery, for example, and thinking, as all of us do, how could that ever have been? What were they thinking? How could they have done that? About women and women's rights. How could they have got that so wrong? About tobacco. How could they have been so stupid? But also knowing that 25 or 50 or 100 years from now, people will look back on us and they will think about something. How could they have been so stupid? But about what? What will it be? What have we got so wrong? Climate change? In sports, I think it's head injuries. We do and always will get lots of little things wrong. We cannot and must not get the big ones wrong. Second, we love our games. I talked about my own love of sports. On a plane a few months ago, I read the cover story of an issue of Sports Illustrated, a special report, they called it, Football in America, Our Game, Our Hearts, Our Minds, the State of the Union. The two SI writers had wandered around the US for a month, talking to players, former players, coaches, former coaches of all ages and stages, from Pop Warner to the Hall of Fame, and also to fans, parents, critics, and to NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, and asked them what football means to them. Many talked about concussions, but many more spoke about how football teaches lifelong lessons, creates lifelong bonds, and makes communities out of people who have little else in common. About how football can make futures, but also how it can break futures. And if there's anyone who doubts the passion with which these people speak, or who turns up their nose at the thought that stupid games can have this impact, wander around US college campuses today. Do it yourself. And sometime in the fall, or even in late August, as my wife and I did 2 summers ago, along secondary roads in the US Midwest, coming into Columbia, Missouri, the home of the University of Missouri, to Kansas and Kansas State, Iowa and Iowa State. There in front of us, preseason practice, hundreds of players, fans catching a glimpse, the excitement, the anticipation everywhere. Go to a hockey rink anywhere in Canada on a Saturday morning. Go to a soccer pitch. It's the same. But where the SI story is wrong, or at least is deeply misleading, is the feeling it leaves that if we are going to continue to play football, this is what we get. The good with the bad. That crucially, you can't have one without the other. You can't have the fantastic with the awful. But for me, what the article really reinforced wasn't a throw up our hands and give up sense of hopelessness, but how absolutely crucial it is that football comes up with an answer. That football gets it right. That it does far, far, far better than it is doing today. These days, Monday through Friday, we hear about all the things that are being done. No contact practices, the protocols, the independent spotters. And then we turn on our TVs on Saturday and watch college football. Then we turn on our TVs on Sunday and watch NFL football. And what do we see? The unbelievable collisions there on our screens. The players who leave the game and then, depending on the game, depending on the circumstances, may find their way back into the game. The fantastic of football cannot be lost, and the awful cannot continue. These are the stakes, and these stakes are high. A third observation: players play. We've seen it in games we've played ourselves and on our own teams. We've seen it with our own kids. We see it on TV. It almost doesn't matter the injury a player suffers. Players play. Our team needs us. Our teammates are counting on us. The game expects it of us. So we play. It's a point of our pride. How often have we heard hockey announcers say, "Ooh, that was a bad one, but he'll be back. He's a hockey player." Even if sometimes it's not a good thing that he or she continues. But what's going to stop her? Who's going to stop her? The referee, a coach, a parent, a teammate, a doctor? Not likely. Everybody needs another set of eyes and ears to tell us when to stop. No matter how old we are, no matter at what level we play, pickup or the NHL, it doesn't matter. Players play because players want to play, because others want them to play, because they need to play. A fourth observation, and it's related to the third. We put more of ourselves into our games now than ever before. We go faster and collide more forcefully in more games, more months of the year. We do more risky things. In part, it's because pro athletes, now paid millions of dollars, feel they have to prove that they are playing for more than the money. In part, because with all sports TV, we, the pros included, see all the amazing, previously unimaginable plays on the highlights. We see, we try, so we push to do one better. And the impossible becomes possible, and the extreme becomes the norm. Compared even to 20 years ago, many of our mainstream sports have become extreme sports. And that sense on the screen of the difference between the old time and the new time, and you saw the clips that Dr. Bales used of old time football and new football. You could do the same with hockey. And one can very easily think that given those kinds of changes, but also given the protocols, the better technology, the greater attention, the better research, the greater focus on diagnosis and treatment and all the rest of it, that in fact things are different and that was an old time and this is a new time. All I would suggest to you is to ask yourself, watch a clip of today's game in football or hockey, watch a clip watch a clip of the previous game, watch a clip of today's game, and say, what is different about today's game with all of the protocols and all the rest of it that is there? All that's better, but ask yourself, do all of those things that make things better about today's game make it a less risky game than the game before? It is a very, very, very different game on those screens. So all of these things that are being done in the context of that, what is the nature of the game that is being played on the ice or on the field. Fifth, head injuries are head injuries, no matter how they happen. The recent conference that David Johnston, the Governor General, held offered a good illustration. In Ottawa, there were representatives and presenters from all kinds of different sports. What do hockey, football, bike racing, and trampolining possibly have in common? Head injuries. Concussions in sports isn't about one sport or another. It is about hits to the head, period. However they happen. Scientists and the public got thrown off for decades because the first scientific study of head injury, as we've seen today, that related to sports, done in the late 1920s, was about boxers. The condition, as we've heard, was called pugilistica dementia. And because it was about boxers, the problem seemed to be about boxing. We, the scientists and the public, never made the broader connection. But what does it matter if a hit to the head comes from a fist or from an elbow or from a crash against the turf, the ice, or the glass? It doesn't. It's all about the brain, and the brain doesn't distinguish. Sixth, the science of concussions and brain injuries has improved, undeniably. All of you here know that. You embody that. But there are lots of things we and you don't know and won't soon know. And you know that, and you embody that also. But one thing you and we do know, because you and we do know this a lot better, and about this you and we are absolutely certain, scientists included. Better treatment for brain injuries is a good thing. Prevention of brain injuries is a far, far better thing. So when we talk about increased penalties and suspensions in sports, about better technologies for diagnosis and better medications and strategies for treatment, talk about prevention first. We and you are much better at repairing broken legs than broken brains. And I need to add something here. And it came from the experience at the Governor General's conference. And it bothered me at the time, but I didn't think it through fast enough to say anything. So I'll mention it now. It's about prevention. Everybody at that conference talked about prevention. All the doctors did. All the researchers did, about how crucial it is. And everyone nodded their heads, and everyone talked about their own work as prevention, because they knew it had to be prevention, because they know prevention is far more important than anything else. But in almost every case, their work wasn't about prevention. At most, it was about secondary prevention. It is research, diagnosis, treatment after an injury has happened so that it doesn't happen again. When I talked about prevention then, when I talk about it now, I'm talking about actual prevention, not reducing the exacerbation of a problem, not putting in airbags after you've gone through the windshield. Prevention, something not happening, not even for the first time. Something that was beyond the work that was beyond the work of those scientists and researchers in Ottawa, just as it is beyond you and me. But it is not beyond decision makers. I'll talk more about that later. But we can't fool ourselves. Research, diagnosis, and treatment are hugely important, but they are not prevention. As I said earlier, better treatment for brain injuries is a good thing. Prevention of brain injuries, real prevention, is a far, far better thing. Seventh, we kind of hoped we were past this. This is the opening sentence of an article in the Toronto Star after Sidney Crosby's most recent concussion a few months ago. We kind of hoped we were past this. Really? Past it? Based on what? In what universe is that journalist thinking? In what Is that we he refers to? What is he thinking? Head injuries, as I said earlier, are the most important question in sports at all levels, and that is hockey, and that will also be tomorrow. Eighth, CTE is scary. In its impact on a life, it's not that much different from dementia or Alzheimer's. It is sports' smoking gun. So now, after the premature death of a former player, we wait for researchers to tell us, did he have CTE or not? CTE may be much more or much less common than we think, and of course, we don't know, and won't know until after a player has died, until it's too late. But more problematic than CTE is something that we do know, because we can see it in some players who are still involved in the game, and in many more who have stopped. Something that will be there as part of their life, day after day, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, for the next 50 years or so if they live that long. Memory problems, anxiety problems, confusion, anger, depression, lousy stuff that makes a life lousy. This is not just about CTE. It's about people. I thought the movie Concussion was good and interesting, but it was the wrong story. The real story isn't about a brave, intrepid doctor and the big bad NFL. It's about Mike Webster. It's about somebody's life. Ninth, science takes time, but games are played tomorrow. It is not good enough to wait for science. Lives are being affected now, today, tomorrow. Decisions need to be made based on the best information, on the best science we have, at any moment, at every moment, now. 10th, it's not about what we think we can do, it's about what needs to be done. Sometimes we confuse the two, or we try to, or we want to, or we spin one as the other. But when we do only what we think we can do, when we don't do what needs to be done, we only manage problems. We don't deal with them. Really, we only pretend. We do what needs to be done. Which brings me to my 11th and final point. Decision makers decide. In sports, scientists don't decide. The media don't decide. I don't decide. You don't decide. Those who run leagues, who run federations, they decide. In some things in our own lives, we are the decision makers. And we know we get things wrong sometimes. But, as we talked about, we can't get the big ones wrong. The ones where 25 or 50 years from now, people will look back at us and say, how could they have been so stupid? It is time for the decision makers to catch up with the scientists. More importantly, it is time for the decision makers to catch up with the life-affecting impact of their sport on their players. Games have changed, and the good news, the great news, is that games can change again. In this room and outside these walls, who are the decision makers? What is stopping you? Thank you.
For that great talk. Any questions? Okay, well, I will ask a question. I think you've articulated what I think many of us really feel, and that's the person sitting in front of you is the person you have to deal with and not worry about what the cause is. But it brings me to a new sport that seems to be gaining momentum in the world, and this is this mixed martial arts, which I didn't really hear about but saw recently and was struck by how popular of a sport it is and how really vicious it is. And I'm thinking, how is this allowed to kind of flourish within this realm of, all brain injury and anything else?
Well, I used to watch boxing. I watched it, and when I was a kid, it was the Friday night fights, and Gillette was the sponsor, and I watched it every Friday night, and I loved boxing. And I was watching the night that Emil Griffith killed Benny Kid Paret in the ring. And I watched some years after that. I can't watch boxing now. Whenever it comes on the highlights, I flip it. I flip it to something else. Because, of course, that on the highlights, you're not going to see anything but some crushing blow. I mean, you're not going to see all of the minutes of a round before that time. Mixed martial arts, when the show itself comes on, I can't watch it. I mean, it is just, it's part of what I was talking earlier about. Once something becomes possible, then it becomes the norm, almost. And so you say to yourself, well, if we're going to fight, it was like in hockey at one time, that fights happened, and who fought the fights? Whoever got, whoever was the one who was the victim in it. It wasn't the designated fighter. It was the person who, was affected. And they were lousy fighters. The fights were horrible fights, and nobody got hurt. And then at some point, somebody said, well, if we're going to have fights, we should at least be good at it. And so then players started to train to become better fighters. And then at a certain point, it was like, well, why should they be fighting? Why don't we have people who are really good at fighters? We've got extra spots on a roster for every game we play. We've got fourth liners who don't play very often. Let's make them into specialists. Let's make them into really, really good fighters. And they are. They're really good. Happily, they're good enough mostly to protect themselves. Unhappily, they can inflict damage. They are good enough to inflict damage, in it. But so that things kind of move that way. Well, then you've got boxing. And so at some point somebody said, well, that boxing used to be bare knuckle and used to be no rules. And as a kid, we always heard about the Marquis of Queensberry rules. So that meant no hitting below the belt, no, whatever, and bringing in gloves. Then at some point somebody said, well, let's have a real fight. I mean, this putting padding on your hands, that's not a real fight, that's boxing. And so let's find out how tough people really are. And so we'll put them into this ring, we'll take off their gloves, and basically it's anything goes, because that's who the really toughest guy is, not the person who is toughest by the Marquis of Queensberry rules. So these things move in this direction. The thing that is amazing is that it's sort of caught on to some extent. Then once it catches on, it's more. The good part is that it's still an extreme sport. And as popular as it is, try to put on mixed martial arts at the Air Canada Centre 41 games, 41 nights a year, the way hockey would be put on 41 nights a year. I don't think you would have 20,000 people there every night. So the good thing is that it's still special event in it. But, that it is part of the extremism. If you can do it, then why not more, and why not more, and why not more? And the only thing that is going to stop it is this kind of, is decision makers, who are essentially saying, this is totally nuts. Look at these people, look at their faces now. And the thing that sort of keeps things going a little bit now is that mixed martial arts and these kinds of fights haven't been around long enough for most of these, performers to have gotten to be old enough for a lot of the worst symptoms to start to appear. So who knows what will happen in the future, but I find it unwatchable.
Other questions?
Yes?
I just wanted to thank you for your emphasis, passionate emphasis on the prevention piece, because I think you're really hitting it on the mark. Single brain injury is not acceptable, and if you can prevent it, is tantamount to essential. So thank you for
Well, thanks. I mean, it's that I think that what stops us, there are a few things that stop us from that focus. First of all, it's that you can't prevent 100%. And so once you're dealing with something that is impossible, then it's easy for the phrase to be, well, these things happen. They can happen anytime to anybody doing anything. And so you throw out that line and you just kind of cut off the sense of will at the knees and nothing happens. Instead of saying, yes, it's true. These things can happen. They will continue to happen. The point is to reduce them, not a little bit, not a fair amount, but a lot. Really, really, really reduce them. That's where the target is in it. Not for the incidental, accidental things of life. It's the rest. So I think that's what that keeps us from really talking about prevention. I think the second is, and basically it's all of us, and who are saying we want to do something, but what are we going to do? Well, the best I can do as a scientist is do this research, that research, and we're all working in these fields, and we know that prevention is really by far the most important thing, but we also know we can't do that. That's not in our hands. That's not in somebody else's hands. So we continue to do the work that we're doing, and we have to do it, and we need to do it, and it's crucial that it's done, and all of the rest of it. And at some point, in order to kind of satisfy that part of us that says, I do it, and then nobody does anything about it, we say to ourselves that what we're doing is prevention. No, it's not. It's terrific in terms of reducing the exacerbation of a problem, but it is not prevention. And that's where it shifts back into the hands. The problem that we have now in a lot of it isn't the science. Science is moving along. As I said, science will take its time because science has to take time, and we know more and we know more, all the time. And as in a lot of things, at a certain point, you always know enough to make the best decision that you can make at any time, and that's your responsibility. The question is whether you say to yourself, well, I don't really know enough. And because basically I don't want to make the decision. So what I'll say is that I don't know enough, and the answer will be in knowing more. And that will allow me not to make the decision. And so you just kick the can up the road, a little further, a little further, a little further. And in the meantime, games are played tomorrow. Athletes are affected. And that's why you get to a certain point where it's not about awareness anymore. There is enough awareness. It is a question of what people will then do with that awareness and make decisions based on that awareness. That's the key point.
How do we deal with and preventing injury? The business aspect. So, there's mixed martial arts is being become successful in this business.
Right.
Violence in hockey has become a thing because there's business. There's aspects that are being supported through the financial support of all of these activities.
Yeah.
So those are decision makers too. How do we combat
Right.
against the
Yeah.
violence?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge of mixed martial arts is that they are in the business of violence. and the business of extreme violence. I mean, basically the appeal is like, oh my God, I mean, what people are willing to do and be able to do and withstand and all the rest of it. That isn't the essence of hockey. It's not the essence of football. You know, that both are, I mean, violence is a part of both of them, but it's not the essence of either of them. And so, and so I think that what you do in order to, you know, and what can be done is you look at each game really carefully, and let's just look at hockey a little bit. Dr. Bales sort of at one point in one of his slides talked about how, you know, are we just more aware, or in fact, or do we have more concussions? And he said, well, it's probably a bit of both, and it probably is both. But what it is a whole lot more than just sort of both and you shrug is that our game has changed. Football has changed, but let's just focus on hockey for the moment. It's changed a lot. It is a game that is immensely faster. And in our minds, I mean, if you know, in my mind, it's going back to being a kid in the 50s. For somebody else, it's being a kid in the 60s or 70s or 80s. In our minds, those games moved like rockets. I mean, unbelievable, those players, they were 10 feet tall, they skated 100 miles an hour. There was nothing like it. Go to a screen, like, you know, the screen of the football there. Not highlight stuff, show full game action. It is unbelievably slow. Unbelievably slow. And it's basically slow because at the time, before the 50s for sure, and then in the 50s afterwards, is that the players stayed on the ice for 2 minutes every shift. And because they did, they kind of circled around, coasted, saw something, burst for an opportunity, burst back for a problem, circled, coasted. The game moves slowly. There's a huge amount of space between players. There's a huge amount of time that the player has with the puck. There were many fewer contact collisions and with much less force. The game's changed. You know, now 35 seconds. It's a relay race. It's where you pass the baton every 35 seconds. It doesn't stop. For 60 minutes, 35 seconds, you know, you're on at second 0, 35 seconds, you're off, the next person on. It goes like that. You know, football has the same, you know, the equivalent thing in its own way. There are that many more collisions. They are that much more forceful. And you start in all of this, just as was alluded to earlier. But alluding to isn't enough. It's the focus. It is a hit to the head is a bad thing, period. And so you start to think about your games in that way. How can we play without a hit to the head? And then you start to think. And then you start to put the best minds together on it. And people who are involved in hockey, they're pretty good minds. They are unbelievably creative because they're unbelievably competitive. And you give them a puzzle. Okay, here's the puzzle. How do you go out, play just as well, play in just as exciting a way, but play a little smarter and a little safer? And you know that there are 10 ways of achieving the same thing. And you know that 2 of those 10 ways leave you really vulnerable and some of the others don't. But you can achieve the same thing doing stuff in a different way. Okay, so what are they? And let's start, you know, that kind of a focus. So in hockey, there are very, very available answers. Football is harder. But in hockey, there are the answers are not that difficult. It is a question of the focus and the priority.
Thank
Sorry.
you. Thank you. That was very interesting.